Okay, welcome everyone to the first IHR Digital History Seminar of the year. We've been out of action for a while now, but it's really exciting to be back with what I hope is a really wonderful schedule of seminars for the next few months, which will be delivered virtually, and maybe at some point in the future we'll get back to our hybrid model, which we pioneered, of course, many years ago, having some in London and then the rest of the world watching us online. It's my real pleasure today to introduce Rob Houghton, who will be from the University of Winchester, who will be speaking to us on a topic which will be familiar to some of you who've been to the Digital History Seminar in the past, because Rob wonderfully contributed to our teaching panel last year, speaking about video games and teaching with a specific focus on medieval studies. Rob is a senior lecturer in early medieval history. And I guess rather than talking about the specifics of his teaching work, he'll be spending more of this seminar talking about his research work, specifically a paper that is on the confluence of medievalist and gaming tropes in computer games. So I will hand over to Rob, who'll be speaking for somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes, after which we'll have time for a Q&A. And if you do have any questions for Rob, please put them in the YouTube chat and we'll be sure to read them out at the end. So, Rob.
Thanks very much, James. There we go. So yes, thanks James and thanks Melody. Indeed, thanks to all the organisers of the IHR Digital Seminars Committee. There's a great programme of events coming up. I've seen the schedule. I'm hugely jealous. In particular, I encourage everyone to attend all the events that they can, but in particular the PG, the PGT, the postgraduate PhD speakers coming up in early December. So yeah, as James has said, I'm talking today about how games represent the past, how they represent the Middle Ages in particular. And I think this is important for a number of reasons. As James has said, I'm very big into using games for teaching, but also for research. So to start off, there we go. So first of all, it's important to emphasise that computer games matter, and this is for various reasons. I mean, possibly most basically, games are increasingly accessible. They're played by a growing proportion of the global population. They're also big business. There's a huge amount of money involved in the production of games, and there's a huge amount of money made from the sale of games and game-related paraphernalia. But beyond that, I think more importantly, or at least more importantly for me, and I think more importantly for anyone involved in academic history, is that games can do serious things. They don't have to just be these facile things to entertain children. They can tell stories in new and innovative manners. They can deal with political, social, philosophical issues in a mature way. Games can be used for education purposes, in particular within the field of history. I've seen games being used at almost every level of study, ranging from primary school all the way through to MA postgraduate study. And they can be great tools for introducing new periods, new regions, new themes of history. We see plenty of research, historical research, being used in the creation of games. So games like Assassin's Creed and Kingdom Come Deliverance, they make extensive use of historical research to recreate urban environments. Games like Total War Britannia, or any of the Total War series for that matter, make extensive use of historical researchers for their material culture and also for the politics, the tribes, the various different kingdoms within their games. And perhaps most notably, Crusader Kings 2 and now Crusader Kings 3 makes use of extensive historical research to create a model of medieval society that's almost insane in its depth and breadth. And we're starting to see this going the other way. We're starting to see games being used as research tools. Sorry. Minor technical issues. Brilliant. Thanks very much, Melanie. Sorry about that, everybody. So, yeah, so we're seeing games getting used as research tools. So whether it's to present as an outcome of research, to present a built environment, to present a reconstruction of a medieval landscape or what have you. But more interestingly, we're seeing games being used to convey historical arguments. So this is built around the idea that game mechanics are fundamentally an account of a model of an element of history. So it's an abstract element of history. It's a limited vision of the past, but nevertheless, it's internally consistent and coherent. In effect, by creating rules for games, designers are creating an argument about the past. In fact, they must do this. Sorry, Melody. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the games are creating arguments about the past. They must do so in order to function. And by playing these games, we can interrogate these arguments. We can look at their shortcomings, the shortcomings of the mechanics. We can look at outcomes which are not expected, whether it's conquering the world for Count of Dublin or what have you. And on that basis, we can create nuanced new arguments. We can engage in historical debate by modifying the game, by altering the rules of the game, and therefore altering the arguments the game makes. And beyond this, games can be hugely important because the formative impact they have on their players. There's a growing amount of evidence. There's a growing amount of evidence that the games influence their players to an extensive level. So we've seen this even with university students. Very often they're saying they get interested in a period of history through playing a computer game. As a result, it's increasingly important for us to understand historical games. We need to understand, first of all, how they present history, but also what sort of history they're presenting, what sort of arguments they're putting forward about the past, about the Middle Ages in particular. And this is particularly true when we come to deal with medieval computer games, or games addressing the medieval period, games which address medieval elements. Because there's growing evidence that games which relate to the Middle Ages are particularly influential on their audiences. They can have a greater impact on not only getting people interested in history, but informing their understanding of the Middle Ages. As a result, it's really important to understand what ideas these games are putting across. What I'm going to argue today is that the image of the Middle Ages which computer games tend to put across, while it's based on common popular medievalist tropes, while this is definitely a big part of the image of the Middle Ages which games put across, this is combined with gaming tropes, with the limitations of the medium itself. And while this can very often just create more exaggerated visions of the Middle Ages, at the same time, it creates often unexpected outcomes, often unexpected representations of the period. To that end, I'm going to talk about, well, three things basically. First of all, I'm going to briefly run through some common medievalist tropes. I suspect most, if not all, of these will not be news to anyone here. I'll then go on and briefly talk about gaming tropes, about tendencies within computer games in general. And finally, I'm going to go on and talk about how these two diverse sets of tropes combine, how they affect the representation of the Middle Ages within computer games. And we'll do that I'll do this over looking at three particular case studies, looking at the representation of violence in these games, the representation of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, and finally the representation of the Middle Ages as almost exclusively white. I'm not saying that this is comprehensive, this is very much a work in progress, but I think this is an important starting point. I'll be very interested to hear any examples, any counter arguments that people have after the presentation. So to start off then, medievalist tropes. Perhaps more than any other period of history, the Middle Ages within popular culture are viewed through a very specific and almost all-encompassing lens. We tend to see the Middle Ages presented, at least within Anglophone materials, as possessing a few key points, a few key elements. So perhaps first and foremost, the Middle Ages were violent and barbaric. We see this within, well, obviously shows like Game of Thrones, but in all manner of literature, all manner of TV, audio, and so forth. It's almost impossible to shake this connection between the Middle Ages and violence, and indeed medieval has become a synonym in many cases for violence and barbarism. This is something that Andrew Elliott's pointed out very clearly in relation to ISIS, the labelling of extremists as medieval, and these extremists coming to take on this image of medieval for their own purposes. So the Middle Ages are violent. Beyond this, though, the Middle Ages are also typically perceived as a time of kings and knights, and typically knights in shining armour. This has a huge impact on how the Middle Ages are represented in popular history, and in particular, this notion of the knight in shining armour, despite its deconstruction in shows and media like Game of Thrones, despite this deconstruction, it's still a prominent trope within anything to do with the Middle Ages. This notion of chivalry, of morality based around these hero figures, is a recurring trope within all manner of medieval media, or medievalist media, rather. We also see a common representation of the Middle Ages as backwards and superstitious, possibly most notably in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's a time of peasants, it's a time of ignorance and superstition. And in no small part, this is connected to the Middle Ages being a period dominated by the church. It's another image which is very hard to shake. The Pope is presented as being the dominant figure across all of Europe in many items of medievalist media. And yeah, this is not something new. This has been going on since the Reformation, at least. And finally, perhaps, and again a significant one here, the Middle Ages are typically presented as being white, male, and heteronormative. So as in particular, it's a particular type of whiteness, typically we're looking at England, we're looking at Scandinavia, we're possibly looking at Germany and France. Southern Europe doesn't really get a look in. Eastern Europe traditionally has also been ignored, although media such as The Witcher and Kingdom Come Deliverance are starting to change that to a certain extent. So various tropes exist within all forms of media relating to the Middle Ages. And these tropes, they certainly have a presence, they certainly have an impact on how the period is represented within computer games. But at the same time, these games are also influenced by a number of gaming tropes. And to start off with this, possibly at the most basic level, games are about winning. This is not the case with every game, obviously, but it's a typical perception that games have to have a winner. Whether it's from something as ancient as chess or Go, right the way through to any number of modern games, including Among Us, which is brilliant and everyone should give it a try, ideally with people you don't mind making enemies with. Games are predominantly about winning, and this influences how they represent more or less everything, including history. As an extension of that, games are about progress. They're about completing the next level. They're about getting the high score. They're about improving your character, improving the stats, your abilities, but also improving your skill as a player. And again, this has a distinct impact on how games represent almost anything. Everything has to be about progression. Everything has to be about ultimately winning. Beyond this, games are typically violent, or at least they're typically perceived as violent. To what extent this is true, well, that's a subject that's constantly up for debate, but it's fair to say that a large portion of games, a large portion of the most commonly played games, have violence as their core activity. Beyond this, gamers are typically presented as white, male, and straight. Again, this is something that's this is a claim, an accusation that's got increasingly less grounding to it. If we look at people, if we look at people who play games, we're increasingly reaching the point where that's even across genders. Certain genres of game are dominated by female players, and we see plenty of gamers who are not white. Nevertheless, this image remains of the gamer as this white, male, straight man. And finally, games can't address serious issues. This is something that's been put about by critics of games and by gamers themselves. There's a great resistance within many gaming communities to admit that games have anything to do with politics or social issues whatsoever. And this gets increasingly ridiculous, where you have games such as, well, Tom Clancy's Division is a handy example of this, which are clearly political in their messaging, but the developers fervently deny that there's any political aspect to the game whatsoever, even as the player is encouraged to participate in, well, movements vital to the current society. So we have these two selections of medievalist and gaming tropes, and I'm not claiming to have come up with a complete list of either of these. As I said, this is very much a work in progress, and there's always time constraints, space constraints with this. I could quite happily talk all night about it. What I would say, though, is these two sets of tropes combine in often interesting ways when it comes to games representing the Middle Ages. And to get to grips with that, well, first of all, I'd like to talk about violence in games about the Middle Ages. Now, this may come as no surprise, but we have games are traditionally violent. In addition to this, the Middle Ages are traditionally perceived as being violent. And as a result, games about the Middle Ages are perhaps more so than any other period. Medieval games are typically incredibly violent. These games focus around violence and warfare. So you'll have combat simulators, anything from Assassin's Creed through to Gloria Victis. But also we have games built around warfare. Total War is perhaps the most obvious example of this. But beyond this, even a game like Crusader Kings 2, which has a huge depth of politics, diplomacy, economics, and so forth, even a game like Crusader Kings 2 is fundamentally still all about warfare. This is the core function of the game for most players. So this should perhaps come as no surprise. We have a typically violent form of media dealing with a period which is typically presented as violent. We've just got a very straightforward case here of the nature of games as a medium exaggerating existing medievalist tropes. But that's not really the end of it. I mean, we also see the intrusion of ancient and modern elements of violence into the Middle Ages. A couple of examples being, well, gladiatorial contests, more at home in the Roman period, very often getting imported into fantasy or just general role-playing games within the medieval period. And in the other direction, we see violence against heretics and heathens, the burning of witches. This is a commonplace imposition within all forms of medieval media. It's an imposition typically from the early modern period. So again, we have games following much the same route as media in general. But the nature of games changes the way in which violence, or at least the nature of games brings out some interesting aspects in their representation of medieval violence. And possibly core to this is the need for violence for progression. So looking at role-playing games here, looking at these games which allow you to create your own character and to progress this character, becoming more powerful, more competent as you complete quests, as you roam around the game world. And you do this by gaining, typically you do this by gaining experience points. And the vast majority of these points are rewarded for defeating enemies, typically violently. The drive for progress within games makes violence a core function within these games. So it makes violence a core mechanic within these games. It moves beyond just being a casual violence within other forms of media to being something that's central to the very essence of games themselves. We've also seen the emergence of hardcore games, most often in and around the Middle Ages. So we can go all the way back to Rogue from back in the 80s. Games which incorporate things like permadeath. So if you die in the game, that's it. You have to start over again. You have to create an entirely new character. We see this in modern games as well. More Time is a particular example of this, where you lead a band of adventurers, and if any of them die, that's game over. Well, that's the end of it for them. We also see games like Dark Souls and Mordhau, which are built around detailed and complex conflict and punishing conflict, unforgiving conflict. So if you put a foot wrong, your character will be defeated, will die, you'll quite possibly be punished as a result of that. And while it's true we see these hardcore games emerging within other historical periods and within science fiction game genres as well, this is particularly pronounced when it comes to dealing with the Middle Ages. And I think this is an example of the cohesion of these medievalist tropes with these gaming tropes, with these game mechanics, which is creating these hardcore games in particular surrounding this period. As a final note here, it's also important to consider the influence of this perception of the Middle Ages as a time of knights, as a time of chivalry. And this has had an impact on the way violence is presented within games. So first of all, violence is presented as a moral action. You have to be given an excuse to be going out and killing all these orcs, all these opponents. There has to be a justification for what you're doing. And in many cases, this is done by creating a group which is always unfathomably evil. But beyond this, the notion of chivalry kind of feeds into game balance. And this is an important element of competitive games, is the idea that every player should have equal opportunities to emerge victorious. So there are various aspects of medieval violence which get represented in interesting new ways, I think, within computer games. I'd like to move on now and talk about the representation of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages. And once again, this links right the way back to one of these core medievalist tropes, that the Middle Ages were backwards and superstitious. And to a certain extent, in fact to a large extent, games follow this trope. Games tend to follow this trope. So almost invariably in role-playing games and games in other genres for that matter, the Middle Ages will come on the tail of a glorious empire. There'll be ruins of this former dominant power, this often technologically advanced, culturally advanced power will be dotted around the landscape. This has strong parallels to what remains of Rome across Europe within the Middle Ages. And there's various reasons for this. It's useful as a storytelling device. It's useful to be able to send a character down a dungeon in order to retrieve an ancient weapon, which is somehow more powerful than the thing they could pick up brand new from the forge. It's a useful trope within the game. Again, though, this is something that's present within medieval media more generally. And we do very frequently see representations of the Middle Ages as this traditional Dark Ages. This period dominated by peasants, by dirty peasants typically. But it's a bit more complicated than that. We see different perceptions of the Dark Ages within various computer games. So quite often we see images of eternal Dark Ages. This, again, turning to Dark Souls. This repeated cycle of violence, barbarity, but a complete lack of progress of any sort going on for centuries, if not millennia. We see representations of the Middle Ages as a golden age, following this more romantic tradition, where you have powerful knights doing noble deeds across a rural idyll. We see the production of medieval stasis, or the representation of medieval stasis. So this can tie in to the unending dark Middle Ages, but this can also be a more positive thing. This can also be a more positive representation of the Middle Ages as a timeless period of nobility. And we also see representations of an industrial Dark Ages. So the example I have here is from Dishonored, where there's a very clear industrial age steampunk aesthetic here, but this is twinned with a lot of medievalist, tropes, architecture, and so forth. And again, it's important to emphasize these are elements that are present across various different media forms. The reason I brought them up here is it underlines that it's not quite so simple with medieval games. They're not universally about this very straightforward Dark Ages, this period that's always and inevitably backwards, superstitious. And there's one particular element that I'd like to draw on a bit further here, and this is the influence of games being about progress on this representation of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages. And this is particularly visible in the strategy genre of games like Civilization, and to a certain extent Age of Empires, Total War, and so forth. Because these games, they're very commonly built around technology trees, which you have to progress your way through, getting progressively better units, buildings, abilities, and so forth over the course of the game. And this leads to the creation of a different perspective about the Middle Ages. One of constant progress, one that builds on Rome and that builds towards the Renaissance. And this stands in stark contrast to the more traditional perspective of this period of darkness, this period of backwardsness. There are various problems with this representation, but it's a representation which we don't tend to see in any other form of media. And I think this is a direct product of the mechanics necessary within these games, these mechanics of progress. As a side note to this, we also tend to see the equation of science with culture within the strategy genre in particular, but within games more broadly. And I realise now I should possibly have made this image slightly larger. This is from the tech tree of Civilization 4. This is primarily, throughout the Middle Ages, you might be able to make out at the bottom, we have feudalism as a technology, we have theology as a technology. More reasonably, we have engineering as a technology, all within the same area. And this is quite significant, because typically when we have games like Civilization, these games that span this vast period of time going all the way back to, well, almost prehistory. Typically, these games, within their tech trees, when you reach the Middle Ages, the technologies become culture. They become cultural issues. So we see these things like feudalism, like theology. You might find chivalry in there somewhere. These things which aren't really technologies. And there's something interesting going on here, because while you have this overarching argument about progress being constructed by these games through their technology trees, this kind of takes a swerve, because the technologies within the Middle Ages are not really technology, it's more cultural. So there's something interesting going on here, and I think it's something that we don't really see in other media formats. So, finally then, I want to talk briefly about the White Middle Ages, or the concept of the White Middle Ages, and how this is represented within games. So, as I've said, one of the typical medievalist tropes is that the Middle Ages were white, and more specifically, Northern European white. At the same time, we have this typical perception of gamers as being white, male, and straight. And as a result, oh yeah, and beyond that story, of course, we have this concept that games can't and shouldn't address serious issues. And as a result of this, we tend to see games which follow a number of tropes. We tend to see games which are Eurocentric when they describe the Middle Ages. So on the left here, I have the faction select map from Medieval Total War 2. And you can see the map is centered around Europe. The vast majority of factions you can select to play as are European, ranging from the Holy Roman Empire through France and England down to Portugal and Scotland. Meanwhile, we have 3 Muslim factions available: the Almohads, Egypt, and the Turks. That's it. And this is not at all atypical of strategy games like this. There's a considerable focus on Europe. And even when these other, even when factions are available, where characters are available who are not from Europe, very often it's simply a palette swap. These factions will follow the same mechanics, the same arguments about their nature as any European faction. And the example I have of this is over to the right here, or a particular example I have of this is over to the right here. This is a building from Age of Empires 2. It's a monastery, and it's a monastery as built by African kingdoms. The issue here is the model for this monastery is taken from the Djerba Mosque down in modern-day Ghana. So straight away we have a Muslim building being used to represent a Christian structure. It functions mechanically identically to Christian monasteries. This is something that has clear issues with this representation here. Furthermore, this building is used for any kingdom within Africa, ranging from Mali, where it makes a certain amount of sense, over to Ethiopia, the stringently Christian kingdom. And this all comes down to the Eurocentrism of the designers. Not only is Europe the main focus of the game, it's the main focus of the game mechanics. And these mechanics, when other areas where other kingdoms are incorporated, these mechanics remain the same. We retain this image of Europe as the only way forward within the Middle Ages. Beyond this, we see the erasure of race within many games set in the Middle Ages. We see, so of course we have this. Well, this is the cast of The Witcher, which is almost exclusively white. And over on the right here, more recently, this is the average character created by players for the pre-release Baldur's Gate 3. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the character trends towards whiteness and maleness as well. Within these games, there are no black people. There are no people of color. We do see some better representation of non-white people within many games set in the Middle Ages. A particular example of this is within The Sims Medieval, which will allow you to create a character of whatever, to look more or less however you would like them to look. The issue here, as being raised by Higgins Shroud, is that this is purely cosmetic. You can change your appearance, but you still exist within a very white world. The other characters within the game world are still white. They still react to you as if you were white. There's no consideration of the impact. There's no consideration of interactions between different racial identities within the period. It becomes a very bland, very limited approach to the period. It's also important to note that we see a lot of use of fantasy races within games which address medieval elements. So the example we have here is from World of Warcraft. And there's some potential here to investigate issues around racial identities through the use of fantasy races. By and large, this is handled incredibly poorly. And we see this within World of Warcraft, the various races that have been created here. They typically have very negative racial stereotypes attached to them. So the orcs, they're a combination of African Americans and Africans. The trolls, they're a variety of Jamaicans, leaning on a huge number of stereotypes involving dreadlocks, Rastafarianism, and so forth. Even the elves, they're leaning very heavily on Eastern stereotypes, taking a combination of Korean, Chinese, Japanese tropes, and so forth. And all of this comes to a bit of a head when it's combined with the issue of violence within these games. And as I've said previously, because violence is the main source of experience, the main way of progressing your character and progressing yourself through the game, this violence needs to be justified. And the most common way of doing this seems to be to have a race that is universally evil. And the example we have here, well, this is Shadow of Mordor, but indeed anything across the entire Lord of the Rings franchise has this race of orcs who are inevitably evil. So you're free to kill them, to enslave them, to do whatever you want to, because they're evil. It's fine for you to gain your experience points this way. And this sends some alarming messages about interactions between different racial identities in the period and in general. There are a few examples of more positive approaches being taken within game design. An example was raised by Houghton is use of fantasy races or use of role-playing games with medieval elements as a way of exploring different cultures. The example he uses are the erudite race from EverQuest. So this is a race which is clearly black, but it does away with many of with almost all of the stereotypes associated. So it's a race of wizards, a race of scholars. The erudite race is, in many ways, it occupies a position very distinct from, which is very far from negative. There are still some issues here because it's still sidestepping real-world issues, but this is perhaps progress. One final element here is the development within Pillars of Eternity, of cultural mechanics. So Pillars of Eternity retains a racial system, so you see various different fantasy races available to the player to select. But this is combined with cultural backgrounds. So you can be a human from the north, you can be a dwarf from the south. That is all absolutely fine. And it's generally these cultural backgrounds which are presented as the biggest driver for the character within the plot, for their character stats, and also for the reactions of people within the world around them. It's based much more on the culture than your culture than on your race, which is an interesting experiment going on there. I'm not convinced that it's been done completely successfully, but it's nevertheless very interesting. So, just before I wrap up, I do want to emphasize again that this is by no means comprehensive. So even the areas that I've talked about, there are many other issues that I'd love to talk about further, but we can look at this in different ways and in different areas surrounding the Middle Ages. So the issue of rulership, how kingdoms are ruled, and how that's represented within games. This is driven to a great extent by common conceptions of the Middle Ages, but also by the tendencies within games in general, the requirements of the media. Issues around morality, religion, are also formed from a combination of these conflicting tropes. And likewise, gender and sexuality, and its representation within these games, this follows many of the same issues as representations of race and racial identity. So, to wrap up then, I suppose there's four key things I'd like to leave this one. So first of all, I think it's important to consider there's this confluence of tropes within medieval games, or games which draw on the Middle Ages. So yes, these standard representations of the Middle Ages within public history, within popular history, they're certainly important. But at the same time, we have to consider gaming tropes. Because these tropes, they can lead, this combination of tropes can lead to an exaggeration of stereotypes, whether that's as Middle Ages as violent, Middle Ages as backwards, Middle Ages as white, or any other number of things. But at the same time, they can also emerge in unexpected new combinations, which I think are well, very relevant to us when we come to teach the games, but also very interesting to see how they've emerged. And the final thing that I'd just like to end on, so many of these tropes can be overcome. And this is something where, well, there's been a significant volume of excellent studies into race and racial identity within games, into gender, into sexuality within games, and ways in which these standard representations of these issues within games can be challenged, whether that's through counterplay by playing games in a way that they're not intended, or whether that's through user modification or the creation of new games from scratch. So there's a huge amount of potential to do a lot of very interesting things with and around games. I'm very hopeful that we can get, well, a more interesting representation of the Middle Ages, and one that's going to be more useful for teaching purposes, for impact purposes, and so forth. So thank you all very much. That's my contact details. I'd love to take any questions immediately, or drop me an email, drop me a tweet. Thank you.
While the questions are kind of hopefully percolating in the chat, I just wanted to take chair's privilege, I guess, to ask a question. And it's about something you said really early on, which was to do with the kind of unexpected representations of history that might complicate or undercut some of the medievalist tropes of games. And I was struck, for example, by when you talked, for example, about process mechanics in games breaking a kind of a trope, for example, the trope of stasis about the period, and then that happening via a culture mechanic. And so you've got kind of two mechanics that are kind of breaking a trope kind of in combination. And it reminded me a bit of the way in which, say, literary scholars, for example, deform poetry or literature, or the way in which sort of computational artists take art and deform that as a way of kind of re-seeing it and reviewing it. And I'm not suggesting necessarily that your methodologies come from there, but it made me think really about sort of where the kind of major methodologies within the study that you're doing are coming from. Are they primarily coming from historians, or are they coming from media scholars, or is it one of those classic spaces of academic work where we're just trying to pull together a series of different ideas? Because of course you're an expert in historical by training, but presumably you're pulling things in from other spaces. And I just wondered if you could briefly speak to that.
No, you're absolutely right. So that it's a ridiculously interdisciplinary field. And you're absolutely right. There's a lot of similarities. What I've been saying, from what I understand of literary theory, of cinema theory, there's a lot of similarities with what I'm doing there. You're absolutely right. We often talk about games as being this unique medium, this uniquely interactive medium. But it's absolutely right to look at them in this broader context, look at them in the same way as we'd look at literature or film. I am very much coming at this from a historian perspective, but one kind of gently tempered with the game studies elements. And that's largely a result of my background rather than any overarching preference there. And I have been, I've been doing my best to incorporate literary studies within this as well. Yeah, that's not really answered anything, has it? It's a very that's basically it. It's a very interdisciplinary study, a very interdisciplinary area. It's something that we need to, it's important to have contacts with across departments.
Okay, thanks, Rob. I'm gonna start with a question from the chat then, which I think I'm just going to read out because it probably is just
Right.
Easier than getting someone else to do it. So we've got a question from Albert de Van Vez, who also left a number of comments in the chat while you were going along, who asks, he says, I'm often lost for words to explain to my friends why the Middle Ages weren't as violent as they see in pop culture. Can you give us some leads to answer this question?
Oh God, yeah. I'm just no. Well, I'm trying to think of games that don't have such a violent bent to them. So I direct you straight to, well, Reigns is interesting. It's inherent. There's some inherent violent elements within it. It's basically it's a new take on a king simulator. Basically, if you engage with it at all, it's kind of a cross between Civilization and Tinder. So each turn you get given a choice, a decision to make relating to your kingdom, and you have to manage these various statistics, which will go up or down depending on your yes/no choice each year. And it's really interesting because it's all about ruling a kingdom, but there's warfare in there, but it's hugely marginalized and it's hugely pointless. And this, I think, is perhaps a more interesting representation of the Middle Ages than you get from a lot of these more complex strategy games. There are plenty of other games as well which are set within the Middle Ages which aren't based around violence. I've possibly overemphasized the role of violence within these games. So I suppose, from a games perspective, looking at things like Patrician, Rise of Venice, maybe Anno 1404 at a stretch. But if you want to get, I don't know, I suppose getting more interesting, you try counterplay with them. So can you play your way through this notionally very violent game without killing everyone? I don't know. I'd be really interested to hear how that goes, though.
I really like the idea of counterplay because, I mean, I've got a Dreamcast in the background, so I have a heritage of playing games, though I don't play many these days. But I think there's something about what you didn't talk about a lot with things like sound and things like emotion and feeling, and some of those things can draw you into these kind of absurd violent fests in which you sort of, if someone was standing beside you, they go, what are you doing, this is awful. But there's something about that full media experience, I guess, which maybe does make counterplay really challenging. We have a question. You can address that in a minute if you want to. But I have another question on the chat from Richard, one of our conveners, who asks, do you see the tropes of gaming changing in the future with wider and broader groups of developers? Or are really these tropes so entrenched that you feel they're kind of hard to change within the community?
Well, yeah, thanks, Richard, and also thanks for having me. I think I said something about this the other day. But basically, I'm increasingly thinking that independent games are going to save the world, because these tropes are fairly heavily embedded within a lot of games. A lot of these mainstream AAA games. Developers are reluctant to take risks simply because there's so much money involved. There is, however, there's plenty of market for games which take on new approaches, whether that's within the Middle Ages or representing the Middle Ages or elsewhere. And I think there are signs that the market's broadening a bit. So we get this follow the leader effect. So there'll be one game will be released that goes off in a drastically new direction, and about 3 months later there'll be a dozen other games which look very similar to it and suspiciously similar to it. There's a few examples of this. One of my personal favourites at the moment is either Mount and Blade, the first or the recently released sequel, where you have the potential to play as a king, but you play as a king from the first person perspective. So if you want to have an improvement built on your castle, then you have to travel to the castle. You have to hire engineers. You have to put in money over there. If you want to tell a vassal to do something, you have to find them, and it's a different approach. It kind of takes away one of the issues I didn't really talk about today. But yeah, how do you rule a kingdom in the Middle Ages, where you can't just get on the phone and tell your marshal that you want him to raise an army? So there are all these new and interesting approaches that are emerging, and I think I have no idea what's going to be dominant in the next few years. I think that it looks to be like there's a great drive for greater role play across most genres of games. We're almost certainly going to see more Vikings coming out just in the wake of the Vikings series, The Last Kingdom, and so forth. And in fact, yeah, we've already got Assassin's Creed Valhalla coming up. So I think I have no idea where it's going, but I'm pretty sure it's going to become more diverse. And I'm generally thinking that's a good thing.
Okay, I'm just going to hand over now to a question from our director, Melody.
Hi, thanks very much for that wonderful paper. And I just had a comment and a question. So the first comment was, have you taken into account sort of the commercial aspect of the game? So for Crusader Kings, for example, you showed the different individual kingdoms that you can play. But if you purchase the 10,000 downloadable contents, you can actually play lots of African and steppe and Middle Eastern nations as well, which are not included in the core game, but are certainly in the game if you purchase the additional bits. The question I have is more about violence and race and how they're portrayed in games. So you mentioned Kingdom Come Deliverance. That game I found really very intensely depicted the kind of the horror of violence and the difficulty of violence and of racism, albeit racism from Eastern Europeans against the steppe, as opposed to skin color racism, but it was still clearly racism and being dealt with quite astutely. The same is true, I feel, for Senua's Sacrifice or Hellblade, where the violence in that is very intense and meant to make you uncomfortable, not to glorify it in any sort of way. So I wondered how you sort of dealt with the Middle Ages are violent, but using that to actually address some of these questions in a thoughtful and humane manner.
Yes, right. So yeah, I'll do the commercial aspect first, because that's a nice, easy one, I think. I will say Paradox, Crusader Kings 2, Paradox games in general. You're absolutely right. There's a vast amount of downloadable content, which does hugely expands the game. You're absolutely right. And this does give you the potential to play as a Muslim character over as far as India, down to sub-Saharan Africa now as well, which is brilliant in terms of representation. The issue with it is the core game mechanics remain all about this very European feudal system. And this doesn't, it trips things up as soon as you move outside of Europe. It trips it up when you move into any sort of other political systems. So you can play as an Italian merchant republic, but it's really clunky because you're playing with a system that's designed for feudal Europe. So I think you're absolutely right. There's a huge amount of potential within Crusader Kings. It's just games like this, even with this huge breadth, they still keep getting drawn back to this Eurocentric rule set. So even though there's this much broader geographical range. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Senua's Sacrifice, that's the game I should have been that's probably the game I should have pitched as the Middle Ages weren't all violent, or at least they weren't all unthinkingly violent, because you're absolutely right. It's incredibly thoughtful account of violence within games. And I know that Kingdom Come Deliverance is obviously it's problematic for various reasons, but the representation of violence and horrors and the racism within it is at least interesting. So I'm glad there's these more thoughtful approaches coming out, and I'm really hopeful that we're going to get more variety in there. I really want to talk about these games more and play them in more depth. I think the thing is that they're still very much in the minority currently. Unfortunately, I think if you pick a medieval game at random, it's much more likely to be have someone thinking killing 100 barbarians sort of game without any thought to, well, what's the underlying cause of this? Why am I killing these barbarians? Why is this an okay thing for me to be doing? Why do I even call them barbarian in the first place? which I think might have turned into a bit of a tangent there. But is that just about? Does that even address what you were asking? Sorry, Melody.
Yeah, I think I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on it. And sorry, Albert, if I blew out your ears.
I have just two final questions in the chat, which I'll give you at the same time. They're quite different, but I'll give you them at the same time. And so one, James Jeffries asks us, he says, you mentioned earlier that games can often build an interest in history for gamers. How do they do this and why? And then a question from Jack Newman, one of our conveners, who asks, have you seen a growing alignment between gaming and far-right ideology, which often seems to use online platforms to target gamers and young men? So a question about, I guess, developing interest in history among gamers, and a question about alignments between gaming and the far right.
Brilliant. Okay. So yes, how do games build interest? It's slightly complicated. I've got a couple of articles about this, and if you drop me an email, I'll send you links or send you the documents. That's absolutely grand. Broadly speaking, I think, well, partly it's down to interactivity. Partly it's down to the level of immersion that the interactive nature of games can give players. It's the way that they can make you feel that you're actually participating within history. Beyond that, though, games are particularly potent within the pre-modern period. And I think this is largely because we just don't teach it in schools. You typically get a few key pivotal events from the Middle Ages will get covered. So you'll probably be, if you're studying in England or Britain more generally, you'd probably pick up 1066. You might get something on the Vikings, and there'll probably be something on the Tudors. Other than that, maybe the Crusades. Other than that, there's this vast emptiness around the Middle Ages, and games can very easily fill that. I should point out as well, so this is, games can be hugely influential on their players. It varies hugely depending on what genre of game you're playing and how much you're playing it. So if you're just hitting a casual medieval game, then it's not going to have a huge amount of influence on your understanding of the period, although it might get you more interested in the period. If you're playing something like Crusader Kings or even Total War, that's going to inform your understanding of how things work within the period to a much greater extent, because you're basically forced to learn. In order to beat the game, you have to understand the mechanics, and by understanding the mechanics, you understand the argument the creators are putting forward, so you're getting an image of the Middle Ages in that way. Like I said, drop me an email. I'll send over the articles. I'd be happy to talk about that in considerable depth, because I'm quite boring, as it turns out. But finally, the games and the far right ideology. Yeah, this is a really disturbing one. This is something that Amy Kaufman and Paul Sturtevant, I've murdered both of their surnames. It's something they write about in some detail within the Devil's Historians and the recently released book. There's also Andrew Elliott, who talks about this a lot within all of his work, but his various volumes on medievalism. And you're absolutely right. There is coalescence of gaming with far right movements, and it's typically around the games rather than within them. So developers are very keen to avoid being even vaguely associated with the alt-right for fairly obvious reasons. I like to think that by and large, game devs aren't fascists. I know there's been a number of very, very visible exceptions to that. But certainly, within game forums, it's very typical to find right-wing, far-right ideology emerging alongside games. I mean, Crusader Kings 2 is a big example of this. We've got the whole Deus Vult element of the game, where the game's released. Well, it's just what gets called when Crusades are called. By the time we get to the present, that's changed entirely. Deus Vult's been taken as a rallying cry across various areas of the alt-right. It's being used within and around the game for those purposes. And I'm not sure how best to combat that. It's a major concern. It's something we definitely need to be aware of. And this ties very neatly back to, it's something that we need to be very aware of when we're talking about these games, when we're thinking about how students have been influenced by these games when they come into our classroom, because it's not just the games that will have the influence, it's the community around these games. And I'm not saying that every student who's played these games will be coming in sporting a swastika tattoo, but we need to be aware that they will probably have been exposed to these ideas and these perceptions of which these ideas build of the Middle Ages. It's certainly not helped by the fact that the far right have embraced many of these medievalist tropes. So any form of media, including games which reflect these tropes, will in turn almost inevitably get embraced.
Thanks, Rob. And I think that's a really sort of wonderful place to end. I think what you talked about at the end there in particular, about the fact that, you know, games are ultimately situated in their own circumstance of production and can very quickly look outdated based on certain mechanics, is really important and interesting, and it reminds us the facts that games themselves have a history as well, and that what you're trying to do here is both look at the representations of a historical period which itself has change over time built into it, through a genre which has change over time built into it as well. And actually that's a really complex combination of kind of things to try and work between. What I'm going to suggest is that we close now, and I might ask you to send me a link or two to a few important things that we might better stick in the chat at a later date, so people can come back to that later. I also just want to thank you for being such a wonderful speaker, and for being our kind of guinea pig of our new way of presenting these seminars, including having a director in your ear occasionally, which the audience can't hear. So if any of the audience wondered why Rob occasionally paused, he probably hasn't had media training just yet. Maybe, or maybe you have had media training, but just not for a while. I'm sure I'd be desperately confused if someone was talking in my ear or sending chat messages to me while I was giving a paper. So thank you so much. I think you dealt with it really wonderfully. So yeah, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. We'd normally have some clapping in the room, but I'll just do my own sort of clapping here. And I guess that means that next time we need to have some kind of button that sort of does a clap effect. And the final thing to say is that the Digital History Seminar returns on the 24th of November, which I've just put in the chat the details of, with Zoe Alker from Liverpool. Finally, and a talk that's been cancelled twice for two different reasons, speaking to us on the topic of data mining convict tattoos. So thanks to Rob, thanks to our audience, thanks to Melody for being a wonderful director of this, and we hope to see as many of you as possible in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.
Thanks very much.